Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of paranormal stories, so buckle up because it's time to get comfortable, subscribe, and let the darkness take control. In 2001, I was 3. I was an only child at that point. My parents and I lived in this rent house my mum still lovingly refers to as the shack. The shack burnt down only months after we moved in, but it was a good house as far as I remember. It was old and small, but it was where I spent my first 5 years, the good years, before stuff really hit the fan. It had a concrete slab of a front porch where I'd draw with sidewalk chalk. It had a living room with a heater that I would use to warm my toes in the morning before preschool. There was a ledge on the bathtub where I'd stand to brush my teeth. The single bedroom had been walled off partially to make my room big enough for a twin bed and a bookshelf. I had a dinosaur blanket. I was really into dinosaurs back then. I don't remember much, just small details. I remember my mum and dad, and I also remember the others. The others couldn't be seen by anyone except me. I would catch a glimpse from the corner of my eye. They were always turning around a corner, ducking behind the couch. They acted like they didn't want to be seen, except for Tommy, who was different. A middle-aged man with a dark blue suit and brown hair and a kind smile. Tommy had the nicest smile that would wash away any bad thought or feeling. He was always a good one. He wasn't there all the time, but I saw him and played with him enough for my family to become acquainted with the idea of him. He was my imaginary friend. I was a lonely, only child. I had made a friend of my own to play with. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except I did have a friend, a real friend, one that was alive and in the flesh. Daniel. It was around 2003. Daniel lived next door, and between our house was a field of tall grass with a path down the middle. We lived in the middle of nowhere in the shack, you see, so our parents would have to walk us over whenever we wanted to play. I remember the last time Daniel played at my house, and shortly after he stopped playing with me altogether. We were in my small bedroom playing with Lincoln logs on the floor. Remember the ones that you could fit together to build log cabins? Anyway, Daniel was lying on his stomach, and Tommy brushed his leg when he was trying to come into my room. Daniel looked up at him with fear in his eyes. I wasn't sure why. Tommy was a friend. He wasn't anyone to be afraid of. I told him, "Scoot over, Daniel, so Tommy can play too." And Daniel screamed and ran out to the front yard demanding to be taken home. My parents laughed when they heard the story and said I must have freaked him out by talking about my imaginary friend. I stood in the doorway with Tommy behind me, and Daniel stared at the door, but not me. I watched as his eyes fixed well above my head, and one thing was for certain that day. I was now not the only one who had seen Tommy. At the end of 03, my parents told me I was going to be a big sister. I was so excited. They also told me we would have to move, and they already had a house ready for us. As that house, and I quote, barely holds the 3 of us as it is, in the words of my mum. A few months later, they closed on a house in the small town nearby. It was less of a town and more of a community. 1 main road, a few hundred houses and a tiny school, and 2 churches. There was one amazing thing though. My best friend from T-ball happened to live right next door, Maddie, and I had hit it off with her the year before, so did our mums. I believe Maddie's mum was the one who told mine about the house being available in the first place. So, we moved in, and I was having the time of my life living next to my best friend. We would both be at each other's houses daily, and we were also in the same kindergarten class. Our houses were only 50 feet from each other. They had been on the same plot of land that was later split, and this little detail will be important for later. I had been a little worried about moving because I didn't want to lose my friend Tommy. Sure, he had made Daniel run for the hills, and I was the only one who could see him most of the time, but I didn't want to move houses and never see him again. My parents had only said the 3 of us were moving. They hadn't said about bringing Tommy, and when I asked, they laughed it off. When I told Tommy this, he just smiled and placed his hand over mine, as if to say, I'm not going anywhere. The new house was strange. You could feel it from the yard. It's like when the AC is on and you can feel it from the crack around the door. Except it wasn't cold air exactly. It was just bad, though it did make you shiver. Maddie's house was the same. We talked about this just the other day, and there are 3 entities we can specifically remember between our 2 houses. One thing I liked about Maddie is that she saw them too. I felt way less alone. To this day, she is still one of my best friends, and we still talk about how bizarre our childhood was. One entity was the little girl. She stayed mostly in my house. She never spoke. She was harmless though, because she was as scared as we were of the Twisty Man. The Twisty Man, we believe, was attached to the greater plot of land our houses sat on. He was seen in both houses. It's hard to describe the Twisty Man. I think of a Dementor in Harry Potter, but it sounds stupid, but it would take away all the happiness, and you'd only be left with fear. He was all twisted and contorted, and a few times would look like he was caught in the ceiling fan swirling around on the ceiling above our beds. He was the color of a fresh bruise, blue and black and nasty looking. He didn't have a face either, just a twisted silhouette. He never spoke, just stayed long enough to nearly give us all a heart attack. Whenever I saw him, it was never long before I saw Tommy too. He would stand in front of it, holding my gaze until it went away. Staring at this man I'd known for as long as I could remember, the happiness returned, the fear melted, and the bad thing sank back into the walls. My sister saw the Twisty Man as a toddler, and Maddie and I saw him several times, both together and apart. I had honestly all but forgotten about him, until Maddie shared with me something that happened about a month ago. Maddie's ex-stepbrother lives in her old house now. Her mum and stepdad divorced and he got the house years ago, but it was since given to his son. Maddie's mum got a call from her ex and thought it was weird. They're civil, but not friends who call and chat. The ex called Maddie's mum and asked, "What was that thing Maddie said she used to see in the house, the thing that she was so scared of?" Her mum said, "You mean that thing she called the Twisty Man?" And he said, "I thought so." Apparently, the ex-stepbrother noticed that the neighbor who lived in the old house was sleeping in the driveway in a camper van. He thought it was weird that a 40-year-old something single guy wouldn't sleep in a house he was paying a mortgage on, so he asked him why he was staying outside. The man told him, "I don't even know how to say this, man, but there's something in that house. It's blue and black and all twisted up and it watches me as I sleep. And I'm terrified. I ain't going back in there." This is a grown man claiming to have seen what we saw 20 years ago, having no context of our story. The third thing was less something we saw and more something that was just there. It would move things, knock things over, flush toilets, turn on faucets, mess with the electronics. More of a nuisance than anything. One time Maddie was sleeping over at my house, she told me to quit tugging the blanket down. I told her I wasn't, and to leave the blanket alone. We both felt a few more tugs before it flew off at the end of the bed to the opposite wall. The worst thing that was in that house that was not an entity, it was very much alive, was my father. I was 6 by the time and he was heavy into his many addictions. I can remember a time when he was good, but by this point he was mostly my worst nightmare. He and his friends, I'll spare you the details partially because I don't even remember it all, though I'm not too upset about that. I do remember one thing. He had a few friends over and they were very far past the point of rational thinking. I knew they were looking for me, and I also knew that finding me would be the last thing I wanted. There was a room in that house that I wasn't allowed in. It was less of a room and more of a boarded-in back porch, but it was where the laundry was. I asked my mum recently, and she said I wasn't allowed in because it wasn't safe. The house was falling apart even then, and the room was connected to the bathroom by a built-in cabinet that had a hole in the bottom behind the door, so you could pull a laundry basket into the bottom cabinet and then reach through from the laundry room to grab it. Although that part, admittedly, was pretty cool. I remember seeing the little girl holding her hand out to me. I saw Tommy behind her and he nodded to me, so I let her lead me through the hole into that room. I'd have never have gone in on my own. I was not a rule breaker by any means. She showed me a loose board and I was able to push it enough to slip behind it. I could hear them calling for me, but she put her finger to her lips as a signal to be quiet. We stayed in that hole for a long time. I don't remember what happened next or how I got out, just that she never left me. I honestly don't know what would have happened if she hadn't have helped me hide. I didn't even know that loose floorboard was there, and neither did anyone else, I guess. They eventually got bored and went to hang out in my dad's truck until my mum and sister got home. More happened, but I won't go into it. My sister, mum and I moved in with my grandparents when I was 7. This would have been around 06. My dad had supervised visitation, which he lost quickly. Things were good at Grandma's. I felt safe and stable and didn't see anything there. But I did miss Tommy. About a year later, the summer before I went into 3rd grade, my mum remarried. The guy had a daughter 1 year older than me. My sister was 3, and we moved a few houses away to another community, even smaller and more rural than the first. I only lived in that house for the 4th semester. They figured out pretty quickly their marriage was a rebound for both of them and they would be better off apart, so I moved back in with Grandma at Christmas since my mum was moving back in the summer anyway, and I missed my old school so much. She, though, had to stick it out until June, being a teacher under contract. While we were living there, though, I felt like Karen from the Babysitter Club. I had my very own morbid destiny. My friend from the street, Gravelback Road, and I were convinced our neighbor was a witch. Looking back, I doubt it. She had a grave in her backyard, but I'm sure it was a pet or something. We thought it was her husband. I saw Tommy a lot living there. I think he knew I needed a friend, and I remember one day we had a babysitter. We heard footsteps like always, and she looked a bit freaked out. I told her, "Oh, don't worry, that's just Tommy. He keeps the bad things away." After that, we played in the yard until Mum got home, and I was scolded for scaring the babysitter. We were back with Grandma through that summer until my mum met guy number 3. He was a good guy when he was sober. The first time I knew he was bad was the first time I saw Tommy at the apartment we were now living in. He had been hitting the bottle all day, and the day ended with him breaking my mum's cell phone, screaming at us and not letting us leave. I was begging her to let me walk to the gas station across the street and call my grandma to pick us up. Please. I had told her, Grandma would let us stay again. I think at that point she was just so broken and embarrassed she wanted to stick it out and hope it got better. And it did, in the morning when he sobered up. But that seemed to be a trend for the next 6 years. That night, Tommy sat in front of my bed, between me and the door, while they screamed at each other again. He held my gaze. I don't know how long I stared into his brown eyes before I finally fell asleep. In 2009, we moved into the brick house, which is where I spent most of my childhood. It's hard because I have so many good memories of the brick house, but it's also where I spent my darkest nights. That house came with entities of its own. There were the Whisper people who lived in my sister's room, and the Bad Thing, and the Stepdad. The Stepdad, like I said, was good most of the time, especially in the early days. We would have nights where we knew to keep our distance because he had been drinking the brown bag juice. But he was a decent guy. It did seem, though, that the worse he got, the more active the Bad Thing was. I'll bring it back to the Whisper people. My sister refused to sleep in her room. Our hallway was shaped like a backwards 7 coming out of the living room, and at the top of the 7 was a bathroom. Perpendicular to that room was my mum's room. Then beside the bathroom, on the small line of the 7 was my room, initially. And on the tip of the top line of the 7 was my sister's, so her door faced my mum's. I hated standing in the small line at the 7. I always had a bad feeling. You could also see it from the bathroom mirror. I had only made that mistake once. After that, I would not look in the mirror until the door was completely closed. My sister would not fall asleep in her room. She always said the whisper people were too loud. She was in pre-kindergarten when we moved there, and she claimed she couldn't sleep because they whispered too loud. One day I was coming out of the bathroom. I had just exited the door when I stopped because I thought I heard something from her room. My mum's door was to my direct right, and about 6 to 7 feet to my left was hers. The noise stopped abruptly, and I thought it was weird. I waited for a few seconds before I heard, directly in my left ear, an older lady's voice saying, "Shh, she'll hear you." I booked it. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. It sounded like I was wearing an earbud, it was that close. I heard them a few other times, but I didn't ever stick around long enough to have them notice me again. Just ignore it became a trend in that house. A trend, a motto, a philosophy. We just ignored it. Remember how I was talking about the bathroom mirror? Well, one day I was brushing my teeth and I made the mistake of looking up, and when I did I saw a shadow. Except, it wasn't on the wall where shadows should be. It was in a void in the middle of the hall, standing where a person would be. It was a shadow but three-dimensional, just standing there. It didn't have eyes that I could see, but I could feel it staring at me. This is what I call the bad thing. The bad thing was much more powerful than anything I had ever experienced. My mum coined it the hallway walker, because she said she could hear it pacing the hallway at night. I quickly moved out to the renovated garage as my bedroom. We had walled it in, added a window and added insulation and drywall, and it was like any other room in the house, and it was huge. It was a kid's dream space. It was also generally free of the entities. For some reason they stayed on the other end of the house, and I for one was grateful for it. The bad thing had this ability to play back our voices. I remember sitting in the living room with my mum and being the only ones home, when we heard my voice from her bedroom saying, "Mummy, come here." We both looked at each other, and she shook her head. Behind her, you'll never guess who was standing, Tommy. He did the same thing as her. He shook his head back and forth slowly. "Mummy, I need you." Our show was paused and we sat in eerie silence. I watched Tommy walk down the hall towards her bedroom. I heard it a third time. "Mummy, and then it stopped. I don't know what Tommy did, but it stopped, and we felt the air shift, took a deep breath. "I think it's gone. For now," we agreed. And she was right. It was gone, but it always came back. This is just one example. We heard our own and reached others' voices all the time. I was constantly keeping tabs of where everyone was in the house. I don't want to know what would have happened if I'd have listened and followed it somewhere alone. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I spent my ride home from school praying my stepdad was already passed out in the recliner. It was a good day if he was. Sure, we had to tiptoe and keep to our rooms, but at least I didn't have to deal with him yelling, cussing, hitting things, etc. On the unlucky nights we did have to endure his drunken stupors, it seemed the bad thing would be more active. He'd show up around corners, talk more, move things, and generally cast a dark, heavy cloud over the house, much like the Twisty Man did. He had a talent for sucking all the happiness out of an area. But on nights like these, Tommy would be there, always silently letting me know it would be okay. My other best friend, who later became my college roommate and godmother of my son, was over one night. Stepdad was God knows where doing God knows what, but it had been a good night. We rented movies, had eaten more than our fill of pizza, and spent the last few hours talking about boys and gossip. She went to the bathroom, and when she came back, she seemed uneasy. I asked what was wrong. "Dude, what's up with your stepdad? Where did he go anyway?" I look out the window of my room, which overlooked the driveway. His truck wasn't there. He's still gone." "No, I just saw some guy in your kitchen and he was wearing a suit." Then she went on to describe Tommy to a T. A few minutes later, we heard the front door bang open and my stepdad stumble in, and throughout the house, he finally grumbled his way into his and my mum's bedroom and slammed the door. I told her that was him. "Then who the hell's in your kitchen?" she asked. I explained the whole thing to her, like how Tommy had always been there to guard me and seemed to show up whenever I needed protection or comfort. "Oh, what, like an angel? Cool." That's all she said. She went on to see him about 4 more times when we lived together. I also had 3 other friends who stayed over describe the man they saw sitting at the table on the couch or leaning against a doorway, all with the same description: middle-aged man with brown hair and eyes in a dark blue suit. On the last night, I truly don't know if I'd have made it out that house. We refer to it as the last night because it was the last night we had to see stepdad. I was 16, and I was done. The situation with him had hit a breaking point. What was once just him stomping around and being intimidating to assert his dominance had become into something physical. Side note for anyone hearing this: please don't say just because it isn't physical, if they're acting like that, it will escalate at some point. Just because it's all been verbal until this point doesn't mean it won't absolutely change in the future. Get out before it does. On this night, the doors were all locked. He'd taken our phones, he was marching back and forth spewing nonsense about how he demanded respect. I snuck my sister into my room and hid her in my closet. I barricaded the bedroom door, put headphones on her and played her favorite songs on my iPod so she couldn't hear him banging and yelling at me to open up. Part of me just wanted to give him what he wanted. Part of me thought, even if the worst happened, I'd finally be free of this. I was so tired. I didn't want to be unalived, which I truly believe to this day that's how that night should have ended. But I just couldn't do it anymore. But then I saw Tommy. He pointed to the drawer of my vanity. I hardly ever went there, it had become my junk drawer. "What?" I asked. He pointed again. I sighed and walked over to it, still hearing the banging and yelling on the door. Sitting there on top of my journals and old camp pen pal letters was my cell phone, the very cell phone that had been confiscated earlier that night. To this day I have no idea how it got into that drawer. It wasn't the first time things had seemed to teleport, but it was the first time I was grateful for the weird stuff I'd experienced my whole life. I took it out and called my aunt. I don't know why, but she was the first person I thought of. She worked with law enforcement, and I knew that she would know what to do. She always did. She called the police on my uncle's phone, and they were there within minutes. I brought my sister out of the closet so we could watch our stepdad finally be arrested for the 6 years of hell we'd gone through. I hugged her and looked over her shoulder to make eye contact with Tommy again, and thanked him. After it was just the 3 of us in the house, bills got to be a lot. My mum was a teacher after all, which wasn't lucrative, even in 2015. I had a cousin who had just had a bad breakup and needed a fresh start. She lived 15 hours away, and was 26 at the time. She and my mum decided that she would move in and help out with us girls and pay a small amount in rent, and it would be beneficial for everyone, so she came to live with us. She moved in the room that had been mine initially beside the bathroom. I remember after a few weeks of her living there, she asked me, "Did you ever sleep with the door open when you stayed in my room?" I laughed and told her hell no. She asked me, "Did it stare at you all night too, the shadow thing?" Once stepdad left, the activity died down a lot, but it was still prevalent. I remember one time I got home from school, as my friend had dropped me off, and my cousin's car was in the driveway. I had come inside and called out to her, and I'd heard her voice say, "I'm back here," clear as day. I had something I wanted to tell her, so I practically sprinted to her room, only to find it empty. I thought maybe she was in my mum's room, the bathroom, my sister's room. I searched, but she was nowhere to be found. I was annoyed. Was she hiding from me? I called her and she sounded confused. "I'm at the grocery store with your mum. What you on about? I'll be home in like 20 minutes. Whatever had used her voice had got me while I was in the house alone. I felt the air grow cold and ran to the front yard, passing Tommy on the way out. He was passing me in the hall on his way to her room. I didn't even stay to see what was going to happen. I just sat in the driveway until they arrived. Things went on like this for the next year and a half. During this time, my cousin had moved in with her now wife, and my now dad moved in. He's a fantastic guy. He adopted me a few years ago. I may have been 24, married and a mum, but it was important to me that he is my dad legally, and he is in my heart anyway. We sold the house the summer before I went to college, and we all moved across the state. We all needed a fresh start. We needed out of that town that held so many horrible memories. We needed to be able to go out in public without watching over our shoulders. So I chose where I wanted to go and they all moved. They lived about 45 minutes from the uni, which was nice. I was able to see them on weekends, but still have my independence. Having my independence and safety, though, turned out to be a curse, as much as it was a blessing. Now that I was finally safe, my mind decided I was in a place to process some of the trauma I'd experienced when I was younger, and I started to remember things that I had suppressed for the longest time. I was waking up nightly screaming. Every night Tommy was at the foot of my bed staring at me with his big, brown, soft eyes until my breathing calmed and I could finally sleep again. Even though that was the last thing I wanted to do. Having these night terrors invaded every aspect of my life. My grades fell, I wasn't doing my best job, and it had been weeks since I'd slept. The last straw was when I was horsing around with a friend from our friend group. It was my best friend from before, another girl, two of our old best guy friends and myself in our dorm room. I'd taken something from one of our guy friends as a joke and was dangling it around, teasing him. He reached for it, trying to get it back, and somehow I ended up pinned between him and the wall. He wasn't being violent, just playful. Something about that, though, set me off. I just remember coming to, crouched on the floor, and they were all looking at me concerned. They told me I started crying, shouting nonsense and hyperventilating. The next day, my best friend and the guy who I'd been playing with brought me to a counseling center. It was then I started to see a therapist, and we talked through it. I started taking anxiety medication not long after, and life was good. I still had my nightmares, but they were getting further and further apart. Tommy was always there at night to sit on the foot of my bed and look at me until I fell asleep, and just knowing he was there made me feel better. I saw him one more time when I was in college after the nightmares stopped. I was pumping gas at the gas station about a quarter mile from uni. It was the last building before a long bridge and then our school. I had just gotten in my car when a guy around my age came up to the passenger window holding his student ID. "Hey ma'am," he said to me. "I know this is weird, but I need a ride back to school. My friends ditched me. I see your parking pass. You going back right now?" My window was down slightly because it was a nice night. It was far enough for me to hear him, but not far enough for him to reach inside. Honestly, he was kinda cute and seemed genuine. I was about to say yes, when I made eye contact with someone in my back seat that startled me. It was Tommy, and he was shaking his head at me. I turned back to the guy who was reaching for my passenger door handle, and I felt a firm grip on my shoulder and made eye contact with Tommy one more time. He had a serious look on his face and was shaking his head even harder. "No, sorry." I locked the doors and sped away and could hear him shouting at me as I pulled out. I held my breath the whole way. I could feel the hand on my shoulder the whole time, and when I put the car in park, I collapsed on my steering wheel and sucked in a deep breath. My lungs were burning at that point. I could feel the hand leave and looked in the rearview mirror to see the empty seat. I spent the next few years in what felt like a whirlwind. I moved cities, transferred schools, got engaged, got married, and even had a baby. Tommy would show up randomly when I'd have nightmares, and a few times when loved ones sadly passed. The night my uncle, who was one of my only positive male role models, so we were close, passed. My phone rang, it was my mum. I looked over and saw Tommy on the couch by me, looking at me sadly. He knew before I did, and he was there until my husband arrived a few minutes later. Occasionally, Tommy would still show up to check on me, it seems. My husband has seen him a few times and he's cool with it. He's had his own experiences with the paranormal and believed me right away. The first time he saw him was after a nightmare. I woke up to Tommy on the foot of the bed, and a minute later my husband jumped out of bed and was screaming. But I explained everything to him and he took it surprisingly well, considering there was a man at the foot of his bed. One day, we were in my car and I'd run to the store to grab a few things, while he sat in the car keeping the heater on. And when I got out, he told me, "Hey, your friend came to visit." I must have looked confused because he said, "Your ghost friend, Tommy. He was in the back seat." I just said you weren't here right now and told him you were safe and thanks for taking care of you. He kind of just stared at me for a minute and then was gone. And that was the last time we saw him for about a year or so. The next and final time was right after I had my son. He was maybe 2 or 3 weeks old at that point, and I was walking into the nursery to check on him while he was napping. I stopped short because standing over the crib was a man in a dark blue shirt. He turned to look at me, and it looked like he had a tear in his eye. And he gave me a smile. "He's cute, isn't he?" I asked. He looked at me. "Thanks for keeping me safe." He looked back at my son and still looked at me like how a parent looks at their child after they crossed the graduation stage. He seemed proud of me, but he didn't answer. The look he gave me made my heart swell. Somewhere deep down, I knew this would be the last time I saw his kind brown eyes. Then, my son began to cry, and I tore my gaze away from the man who had kept me safe my whole childhood. And when I looked back to the space that Tommy had occupied, he was gone. There have been times where I think I made it all up. Maybe Tommy was my way of coping. Maybe he was part of a decade-long psychosis or trauma-induced apparition. But then I think of all the other people who saw him too. Maybe he was really there. Maybe he was an ancestor of mine. Maybe he was a guardian angel. All I know is I don't think I'd be here today if it wasn't for my imaginary friend. I'm 26 now and have 2 loving parents who are the best grandparents ever, and a husband who I love more than anything, and an almost 3-year-old who keeps me on my toes. He's so smart and gives the best hugs. Lately, my son has been smiling and waving at the dark hallway and talking to someone in his closet. He calls him Blue Man. He never seems afraid. Maybe it's his own imaginary friend, or his own guardian angel, or maybe, just maybe, Tommy keeps me safe as long as he could, and now he's watching over him instead. And if it really is him, I know he's in good hands. A little backstory. My father lived with us for a while, 6 months before he passed. He was a drug addict, and over time his addiction turned him violent. We had no choice but to force him out. And that was the last we saw of him. He didn't go peacefully. Since his passing, we've lost 3 more family members. Grief has settled into the walls of our home, thick and suffocating. The air feels heavy, the energy is wrong, and in the past few months, strange things have started happening. My father installed our ceiling fan years ago. It always had a habit of turning on randomly, but after he passed, it became a daily occurrence. Always full blast, sometimes in sync with the TV. At first I thought it was just faulty wiring, but then I noticed something odd. My dad had taped a small screw to the back of the remote to keep the battery cover on it. I'd placed the remote on the table, turned my back, and suddenly click, the TV and fan would switch on. Sometimes I'd have to turn the TV off multiple times before it stayed off. Then one day, my mum cancelled our cable and returned the remote to the provider, and the TV never turned on by itself again. But the ceiling fan still does. We keep my father's ashes on top of our china cabinet, surrounded by a few framed photos of him. The photos refused to stay up. One by one they'd fall, sometimes landing face down, sometimes skidding across the floor. The final straw was a framed picture of my parents. It plummeted to the ground, the glass shattering on impact, and the photo inside was ruined. My mum took that as a sign and removed the rest. The last picture that shattered, it was the one my father had found in storage, right before we forced him out the house. When my partner and I are home alone, we often hear things. For example, cabinet doors slamming, the front and back doors opening and shutting, the unmistakable scrape of chairs moving in the kitchen, drawers being rummaged through and then slammed shut. Of course, each time we investigate, we find nothing. The animals are either asleep in another room or within our sight. And then there are the voices. They come when I'm in the shower, home alone. Faint murmurs just outside the bathroom. Sometimes I convince myself it's just the house settling, until I catch movement in my peripheral vision, flickers of shadows, something lurking just out of sight. And then the other day, I saw it clearly, a brown humanoid-shaped figure standing in my kitchen. Yesterday was my aunt's funeral. She was young. Her passing was sudden, and we were all taking it quite hard. That night, my partner and I sat out on the back porch for hours, just talking. The yard was fenced in, and our dog lay calmly beside us. Then, in the middle of my sentence, footsteps. Loud, purposeful, and approaching fast. And then came the growl. It wasn't an animal growl, but it wasn't human either. It was something in between deep, guttural, and wrong. The second we heard it, every instinct screamed at us to run. We bolted inside, slamming the door shut. My heart was pounding. The hair on my neck stood on end. 10 minutes later, I worked up the nerve to check the yard. There was nothing. No broken fence. No sign of movement. If it had been an intruder, our dog, who had been beside us the entire time, would have reacted. She would have run at them. She would have barked. She would have done something. But she hadn't moved. Later, we talked to my mum about what happened. She just nodded and was like, "Yeah, I've heard it too." We have no explanation. We're not sure we want one. I should start by saying that I was raised between two cultures. My Mexican mother, deeply superstitious and a practitioner of Santeria, and my American father, agnostic, logical, and skeptical of anything supernatural. This left me in somewhat the middle, grounded in logic, yet open to the possibilities. Growing up, my mother would constantly warn me to never play with Ouija boards, that they invite demons and bad spirits into your life. My abuelita, a curandera, a healer who cleansed negative energy, reinforced these warnings. I heard about demons my entire life, but believing in them? That was another thing entirely. Then, when I was 16, something happened that I still can't quite explain. It was about 12 years ago now, and I was hanging out with my mates, Ben, Jeff, and Isaac. Isaac had got a brand new car straight off the lot, maybe 20 miles on it, and we were all hyped, checking it out, and somehow the conversation shifted to ghosts. That's when Jeff said, "I have a Ouija board, let's use it." So we did. Under the glow of a lone street lamp in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oklahoma City, we set it up in the road. It was probably around 10 p.m. We placed our fingers on the planchette and waited. Nothing. We laughed it off as BS and decided to take Isaac's new car for a drive down some back roads on the outskirts of the city. Just four dumb teenagers looking for a thrill. I sat in the front passenger seat, staring ahead as Isaac drove. Ben and Jeff were talking about something stupid in the back, their voices a low murmur. Outside, the road stretched in front of us stark and empty. We were in a remote wooded area, the pavement smooth under the high beams, and then a loud pop. The car lurched, and a horrible grinding noise followed. Isaac immediately pulled over. He grabbed a small flashlight from his keychain and stepped out to inspect the damage. I followed, my stomach already uneasy. My passenger side tire, my side, was completely flat. But it wasn't just punctured. The rubber had been slashed. 3 long, jagged marks gouged deep into the side. I ran my hand along the slashes. They weren't clean like a knife. They were rough and torn, as if something had clawed through it. Isaac and I stood there staring at the road. There had been nothing. No debris, no branches, nothing we could have run over. And it was an equinox. We sat high enough to see everything. He was pissed. His brand new car. Go figure. As he moved to open the trunk for the spare, it happened again. Another pop. I sprinted around the car and Isaac was clutching his leg, his face twisted in shock. He pulled down his pant leg and stomach dropped. 3 long, deep scratches ran down his ankle and calf. Blood beaded along the wound. The driver's side rear tire slashed in the same way as the front. Ben bolted back into his car, slamming the door shut. Jeff followed frantically, locking the doors, and Isaac and I stood frozen for a moment, our breath visible in the cool night air. My mind raced, torn between 2 thoughts. It's just an animal, a feral cat or something. But no animal did this. Finally, we scrambled back into the car, locking the doors behind us. Inside, the silence was suffocating. No one spoke. The only sound was our own ragged breathing. Isaac called AAA, and we waited in tense silence until the tow truck arrived. When I got home, I told my mum everything. She didn't even hesitate. She took me straight to my abuelita's house. They cleansed me, whispered prayers over me, burnt herbs, and recited Roman Catholic blessings. But the nightmares still came. For years after that night, I suffered from sleep paralysis, which is something I'd never had before. I'd be unable to move, as if a heavy presence were looming over me. And sometimes I'd hear scratches. I still don't know what we encountered that night, but I know we left that back road with something more than just a damaged car. When I was a kid, I lived in Stokov, a small city in the Czech Republic with a rich but largely forgotten history. My entire family experienced strange occurrences, shadow figures, unexplained noises, and frequent sleep paralysis. Our house felt off, but when I moved to Prague, everything stopped. I never found much online about paranormal activity in Stokov, yet everyone who has lived there seems to know, almost like it's an unspoken truth. So my recent experience was a few months ago. I was dog-sitting with my boyfriend at his family house in Stokov. We grew up together but reconnected in college and were now dating. That night felt wrong. While showering, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I brushed it off. Later, we started up playing video games, walked the dog, and finally went to bed around 2 a.m. But I couldn't sleep. There was an annoying ticking sound, and just as I was about to complain, my boyfriend spoke up first. You know what's funny? I don't have a clock. The only one here is in the kitchen and it's digital. My stomach dropped. When I was a child, every single sleep paralysis episode was accompanied by the sound of ticking clocks. And at that very moment, the clock stopped ticking. I tried to stay calm, but my boyfriend's next words sent a chill down my spine. Just try and ignore it. They like to be left alone. You lived here too. You should already know. The way he said it, so casually, it shattered what I thought I knew about him. He had never entertained paranormal stories before. He was a skeptic, a rational thinker. And there was no way, at least in my mind, that he would be pranking anyone about this. Then the dog, Jonas, started barking, whining, clawing at the dog leading to the hallway. Should we check on him? I whispered. No, we don't want to go into that hallway at night. Weird things always happen there, especially near the bathroom. I tried to ignore the sound, the fear tightening in my chest. and eventually forced myself to sleep. The next morning, my boyfriend looked at me and hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to scare you, but did you hear the clawing at the door?" "Yeah, Jonas, right?" He shook his head. Jonas was barking from the other side of the hallway. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The name Stokov comes from two Czech words, sto, meaning 100, and chuva, babysitter. Legend says Saint Wenceslas was born here and had 100 babysitters watching over him. One of the most famous landmarks is Wenceslas Oak, who was planted by his grandmother, who was later removed from this earth by his mother on the day of his birth. It still stands beside a chapel, and according to legend, she watered it with his bath water. Strange occurrences are strongest around that chapel. There is a bizarre breathing rock near it. If you touch it, it makes you feel disoriented, like reality is shifting almost. Further down the road is an ancient cemetery, and beneath the city collapsed tunnels and abandoned mines, which remain largely unexplored. There was even a plane crash here, though much of Stokov's history was erased by the communists. Finding information is nearly impossible unless you ask the elderly locals who still remember. 3 years ago, my fiancé and I went for a holiday in Montenegro. We were walking down a little street that was also a marketplace, where they were selling things on tables. At almost every table, someone tried to lure us into buying from them, but we weren't interested in buying anything. Then suddenly we saw one really weird-looking lady selling fruits that looked out of this world. They were huge, perfectly ripe and spotless. My partner and I agreed to check it out. My guess would be that the lady was a gypsy, wearing a black coat with red roses. Her atmosphere was weird. We brought 2 to 3 kilos of grapes and apples. And as we were leaving, I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I took a single peach from her table without her seeing. Basically, I stole it because I was so curious as to how it tasted. Even today, I don't have an explanation why I did it. I'd never stolen in my life, and another option would have just been kindly asking if I could try it, or even buy one for God's sake. But the point is, I took it, and after we left the market on our way to the hotel, I took a bite from the peach. It exploded in my mouth with awful, rotten, creamy flavor. I started coughing, gagged, and nearly puked. I looked at the peach and it was brown and black on the inside. Its core was missing and it had maggots. It was very strange because I could have sworn I didn't see any holes on it. Like I said, it looked spotless before. After we got home, as we were getting ready to go out to the city, I began feeling nauseous, and in a short period I started vomiting and having diarrhea with a fever. It was weird because I didn't swallow any of the fruit. Funnily enough, when my fiancé opened the other fruits we actually bought, all of them were picture perfect on the inside and delicious. It took me 3 days to recover. Now we could speculate that maybe I just contracted some disease from elsewhere. It was just a really big coincidence. The face of the lady burnt in my memory and her atmosphere. She was scary but also kind. Maybe she was a witch. Why did I feel the urge to steal from her? It reminds me of a folklore where some kids wander in the forest and stumble upon a house made of delicious candy and are warned not to eat from it but just can't resist. Could, maybe, this have been a witch as well? And she cursed me for eating the fruit I didn't pay for. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. What did you think of the Tommy story? Was it real, or made up, in the person's head? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I thought it was a really interesting story. But why don't you let me know what you thought of it? That's it from me though. I'd like to extend a huge thank you as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. And for those of you who are signed up, there are some exclusive perks, and if you want to find out what those are, feel free to follow the links to find out more in the description. But until next time guys, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.